When many people begin genealogy, they focus mostly on collecting names and dates. But colonial and revolutionary genealogy becomes much more powerful when we stop viewing ancestors as isolated individuals and start viewing them as real human beings living through enormous historical upheaval. Families crossed oceans, wars divided communities, borders changed around them, entire populations migrated because of pressure, poverty, religion, violence, opportunity, or survival. Colonial genealogy is really the story of how America itself was formed through millions of deeply personal family decisions. This presentation explores revolutionary and colonial genealogy, not simply as records research, but as human storytelling through historical context. One of the biggest mistakes beginner genealogists make is researching families without understanding the world around them. Families do not move randomly. Most migration patterns are reactions to larger historical events. For example, frontier wars pushed settlers westward, religious persecution drove migration. Land grants encouraged settlement, economic collapse forced relocation, and political loyalty divided communities during the Revolution. Understanding those pressures allows genealogists to predict where records may exist and why ancestors made certain decisions. Historical context transforms genealogy from record collection into historical reconstruction. The American Revolution disrupted nearly every colonial family in some way. Some ancestors served directly in militias or continental forces. Others supplied food, transportation, blacksmithing, or labor. Some families fled active war zones entirely. One of the richest sources for revolutionary genealogy is pension records. These files often contain birthplaces, marriage information, migration history, affidavits from neighbors, family Bible references, and military timelines. Widow pension applications can be especially valuable because they sometimes preserve details that exist nowhere else. The revolution generated enormous documentation because the new government eventually required proof for compensation and pensions. One of the most overlooked areas of revolutionary genealogy involves Loyalist families. These were colonists who remained loyal to the British Crown during the Revolution. After the war, many Loyalists faced confiscation of property, social hostility, violence, and political exclusion. As a result, large numbers fled north into Canada or relocated elsewhere within the British Empire. This means genealogists researching certain colonial lines may suddenly lose track of families after the Revolution because they physically left the newly formed United States. Loyalist claims records are incredibly valuable because displaced families often submitted detailed property loss claims to the British government. These records can include land descriptions, family members, former residences, migration routes, and witness testimony. The Revolution literally reshaped the demographic map of North America. The Scots-Irish migration was one of the most influential settlement movements in early American history. These families originally came from Scotland, many relocated into Ulster in Northern Ireland, and later migrated into colonial America. Large numbers entered through Pennsylvania before moving southward through the Great Wagon Road into Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Many settled along dangerous frontier regions where conflict with indigenous nations was frequent. Understanding these settlement chains is essential because these families often migrated together in kinship groups. You will repeatedly find intermarried surnames, neighboring families, chain migration, and repeated witnesses and records. Genealogy becomes much easier when we recognize that frontier migration was usually communal rather than isolated. The Palatine German migration is another major colonial population movement. These families came largely from German-speaking regions devastated by repeated warfare and economic hardship. Many arrived in the early 1700s. Some traveled through England before being sent into colonial settlements. Others moved directly into Pennsylvania, where German-speaking communities became deeply established. These populations often maintained German-language churches, ethnic enclaves, distinctive naming patterns, and cultural traditions. Genealogists frequently struggle with these families because names became heavily anglicized over time. For example, Mueller became Miller, Schneider became Snyder, and Zimmerman became Carpenter. Understanding ethnic migration patterns helps researchers recognize families even after names change dramatically. Modern Americans often imagine stable towns and fixed communities. But many colonial and frontier families moved constantly. Some relocated every few years as new land opened. Others fled warfare or frontier violence. Some followed military roads westward after treaties opened indigenous lands to settlement. This movement creates major challenges in genealogy because records become fragmented across multiple jurisdictions. A family may appear in Pennsylvania tax lists, Virginia land records, North Carolina militia rolls, and Kentucky probate records, all within a single generation. Tracking movement patterns becomes just as important as locating individual records. Land was one of the greatest driving forces in colonial and revolutionary America. After military service, many veterans received bounty land grants. This encouraged large-scale Western migration. Entire family networks often moved together to claim opportunity on the frontier. But this expansion came at enormous cost to indigenous populations whose ancestral lands were repeatedly seized through war, treaty pressure, and forced displacement. Genealogists must understand both realities simultaneously. Colonial expansion created opportunity for some families while devastating others. Historical honesty matters. Understanding these land systems helps explain why so many families suddenly appear in entirely new regions after the Revolution. One common misconception is that revolutionary ancestors must appear in major federal military records. In reality, many served locally in militias. Militia service was often temporary and regional. Men might guard settlements, patrol roads, defend local communities, and assist supply chains. Some militia records survive only at the county or state level. That means genealogists must often research locally rather than relying entirely on federal databases. Local court minutes, tax records, and county histories may preserve evidence of service that never appeared in national archives. Colonial Virginia genealogy is both fascinating and notoriously difficult. Many counties suffered devastating record loss due to fires, war, and courthouse destruction. As a result, genealogists often cannot rely on straightforward birth or marriage records. Instead, reconstruction becomes necessary. Researchers begin piecing families together through indirect evidence such as who witnessed deeds, who lived nearby, who appeared together in tax lists, and who inherited adjacent land. DNA connections between descendants. This is where genealogy becomes investigative historical analysis rather than simple document collection. Historical identity categories were not always stable or consistent. The same family might be described differently across generations depending on location, politics, law, economics, appearance, and community perception. Genealogists must approach historical labels carefully. These terms often reflected political systems more than biological reality. Understanding how identity evolved helps researchers avoid oversimplified assumptions about ancestry and ethnicity. This is especially important in Native American genealogy, colonial racial classification, mixed ancestry communities, and frontier populations. Historical records reflect power structures as much as personal identity. At its highest level, genealogy becomes the study of human survival across generations. A pension file may represent a veteran struggling financially decades after war. A land grant may represent a family risking everything for opportunity. A migration trail may represent religious persecution, hunger, or displacement. The records are not merely administrative paperwork. They are fragments of human lives. When we understand the historical pressures surrounding our ancestors, we stop viewing genealogy as static charts and begin seeing it as living history. Revolutionary and colonial genealogy allows us to watch history unfold through individual families. Wars changed migration, land reshaped populations, political conflict divided communities, identity evolved across generations. The deeper we understand historical context, the more accurately and responsibly we can reconstruct the past. Genealogy is not only about discovering who our ancestors were, it is about understanding the world they survived. Thank you so much for joining me for this presentation on revolutionary and colonial genealogy. In future presentations, we'll continue exploring migration history, genetic genealogy, Native American genealogy, colonial settlement patterns, Revolutionary War research, DNA evidence, historical reconstruction, and advanced genealogical methodology. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like, subscribe, follow, and share.